My book, State of Disaster, was the product of two concerns. The first concern, obviously, was climate change. For the past 10 years, I've been immersing myself into the climate change science to understand this existential crisis and what it's going to mean for life as we know it, but most certainly for migration, both internal migration and cross-border migration worldwide. And the second concern is how to make those displaced by climate change visible to policymakers. Excuse me. Most immigration regimes tend to separate immigrants or migrants into distinct categories. There are those who migrate for economically motivated reasons. There are those who migrate for politically motivated reasons. But these categories don't reflect or respond to the realities of migration today in the world today. Migration is multi-causal. It always has been multi-causal, caused by a wide set of intersecting drivers. Here's one example. In some ways, Central America is ground zero for climate change in the Americas. The Central American Isthmus is affected by hurricanes on two coasts, the Caribbean Sea and on the Pacific Ocean. It experiences volcanic eruptions, earthquakes quite regularly. Part of the isthmus is also disproportionately prone to drought. And so the people of this region experience back-to-back disasters quite regularly. These environmental disasters displace farmers every single year. When farmers migrate internally to cities like San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa in Honduras in search of work, their poverty often forces them to live in equally precarious conditions, usually on the outskirts of cities in so-called shanty towns that make them also vulnerable to climate change's impacts. And in the cities, they may not encounter the work that they seek. They might instead encounter the political and criminal violence that then convinces them to cross borders to other countries in Central America or to Mexico, the United States, or Canada. But by the time they reach the US-Mexico border, our politicians and our news media portray them as economic migrants storming the gates in migrant caravans. Yes, these migrants are economically driven, but lost in this conversation are the environmental and the political drivers that displace them in the first place. Their migration is multi-causal, but that tends to get lost in the conversation. They won't call themselves climate refugees. It's not in their vocabulary, but the stories they tell about the difficulties of farming on an ever-changing landscape where they face routine back-to-back disasters, giving them little room to breathe, speaks to the environmental roots of this migration. But people like these Central American farmers are not prioritized for admission to the United States. So in this book, I explore the policies the United States does have in place for accommodating those displaced by environmental drivers. In a world of accelerating climate change, we need to have policies in place that accommodate those that don't fit neatly into those environmental or into those prescribed categories. So what did I find in my research? Well, I was surprised to find that we do have historical precedents for accommodating victims of environmental disaster. So, for example, in 1953, the Refugee Relief Act, for example, included victims of natural calamity in its definition of refugee. In 1957 and 1958, after a series of volcanic eruptions devastated parts of the Azores, Congress passed the Azorian Refugees Act that admitted some 5,000 people by 1962. And as those of you who have studied the Hart-Celler Act know, the 1965 Hart-Celler Act included in its definition of refugees persons who are uprooted by catastrophic natural calamity as defined by the President of the United States, who are unable to return to their usual place of abode. But despite the small numbers of people that were admitted to the United States under these three categories, the natural calamity provision was always controversial and always contested, and we can discuss that in the Q&A if you would like. So consequently, when policymakers introduced an early version of the bill that became the 1980 Refugee Act, They at first retained the natural calamity provision, but Congress subsequently eliminated it from the final law. So those displaced by natural disasters and climate change are often called climate refugees, but they're not refugees under legal definitions of the term. The term refugee, as you know, has a very precise meaning in domestic and international law. And you see the definition right here on your screen. Nowhere in this definition do you see any mention of natural disasters, the environment, or climate change. We may call someone a refugee or a climate refugee, but that doesn't mean that the law views them as such. So the refugee track in our immigration bureaucracy as it exists today cannot accommodate those permanently displaced from their homes because of environmental disaster or accelerating climate change. At present, temporary protected status is the only legal track in our immigration bureaucracy through which the United States accommodates those affected by natural disaster. TPS was created by the 1990 Immigration Act, and it allows people who are in the United States and unable to return to their country because of an ongoing armed conflict or an environmental disaster. It allows them to stay and work in the United States until the Department of Homeland Security says that it's safe for them to return. There is one catch, however. In order to qualify for TPS, you already have to be here in the United States. One can't migrate to the United States in order to secure a TPS. Who qualifies then? Well, it's tourists and students and business executives and those on temporary worker visas. They are the principal beneficiaries of TPS because they're already in the United States. But undocumented or unauthorized workers can also potentially qualify if they meet certain conditions. The Central American countries of Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, and the Caribbean countries of Montserrat and Haiti are among the 22 nations whose nationals have qualified for TPS over the past 3 decades. All of the Central American and Caribbean countries have qualified because of environmental disasters in their homeland. But in a world of accelerating climate change, TPS is not an adequate response for those who will be displaced. And the first 2 case studies in my book, which focus on Montserrat and on the Central American victims of Hurricane Mitch, they hopefully explain why TPS is not an adequate response for accelerating climate change. The third case study that I have in this book looks at internal migration from US territories to the continental United States, because I felt it was very important to have a chapter in this book that looks at internal migration, because I think we in developed nations or in more developed nations, we tend to think that we are immune to the effects of climate change, and that just isn't true. We need a climate change policy because we're now living in an era of accelerating climate change. At no other time in human history have we had 8 billion people living on the planet, all contributing in some way to the behaviors that are accelerating changes that in the past occurred over thousands of years rather than decades. Much of the discussion that we currently have on climate change has focused on sustainability and on resilience, that is, helping people adapt to the realities of climate change. And these discussions are essential. But how will we respond to those people who cannot adapt and are forced to cross international borders in search of safety? Migration becomes a form of adaptation. Today, 80% of all climate migration is internal within their own countries, but that will change in the decades to come. So in this book, I try to see what we can learn from the past that might serve as a guide for climate and immigration policies moving forward. But this book is more than just a study of migration and of migration policy. It's also a study of the cascading consequences of environmental disaster. Natural disasters are always policy disasters. They make evident the inequality, violence, indebtedness, corruption, failed development policies. They make evident the legacies of war and colonialism. Right now, it's developing countries, many of them former colonial states, that are currently on the front lines of a crisis that they did not create. but we are all going to be affected, and we're all affected. Natural disasters may not be, or natural disasters may be inevitable in a world of accelerating climate change, but human displacement reveals the failures of nation states. And so towards the end of the book, I make a plea for responding on multiple tracks at once. Humanitarian assistance to countries that are affected by climate change are necessary. They will always be necessary. We will need to help populations adapt to the realities of climate change so that they can exercise the basic human right to stay home. We need to address the destructive behaviors that are accelerating climate change in the first place. We have to reassess the development policies that are impoverishing people rather than helping them. And we also need to, as members of an international community, we need to engage in managed resettlement programs to help people find new homes as theirs disappear because of the realities of the world that we're currently living in.